Okay, so we're going to continue and look at the last part of section 6.1, which focuses on the method of factoring called grouping. Now, we talked about in our first couple of videos about how to find the greatest common factor. And that is always the very first thing we try if we're going to try to factor. We always try to take out the greatest common factor first. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. If you can, obviously do that. If you can't, well, then we've got to look at some other methods. And the other methods that we're going to choose are based on the number of terms in the polynomial. And so if there are 4 or more terms, and in this class you're only going to see it with 4 terms, you're not going to see 5 or 6 or anything like that. If we only have 4 terms, then our only other option, if the greatest common factor doesn't work, is to try what we call grouping. Okay, now the grouping process is not super difficult. It's something that we can do without a whole lot of issues probably. And I've kind of given you a step-by-step process of how that's going to work. You may need to pause the video and copy these down because I'm going to move on from this in a second. But the first thing we're going to do is take out the greatest common factor. That is the number one step. That is always the first step with any method of factoring that you choose. Okay. The next thing is then we're going to group the terms. And we're going to group the terms so they factor. So you may want to make a note of this. So they factor. And then we're going to factor each group. And then we're going to factor the entire polynomial. When you get to this fourth step is going to look like these last 3 problems that we did in the last video. So each of these is going to look like one of those. Okay, so just be aware of that. When we get to that fourth step, we should be into that form where we can just take out whatever's in that parentheses as our common factor and have what's left. So with that in mind, let's look at a few. By the way, there's a typo here. This should be a P, not a Q. So make sure you change that. And so we want to group our terms. That's the first thing. You can look at these quickly probably and tell there's not a greatest common factor. And if you notice that, then because there's 4 terms, we've got to go to the grouping method. And again, it ought to be pretty easy to see there's not any common factors because the PQ term is just P and Q. The 10 doesn't have a P or a Q, right? And so there's no numbers, there's no letters, nothing they all have in common. And so now we go to our grouping method. And so the first step in the grouping method, again, there it is. It says to group the terms so they factor. So sometimes you can group the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms, and there's no problem with that. And so we'll try that, but I always encourage you to try to group your terms so that you can take out as many letters and numbers as possible in the greatest common factor, because you're going to have greatest common factors when you do this. And if you can take out as many letters and numbers as possible, then that's going to help you make sure you have the right groupings. Okay, typically there are 2 ways that you can group. There's one way you can't usually. And so in this case, grouping the first 2 and last 2 work, because if you group the first 2 terms, you'll notice they have a common factor of Q. Excuse me. If you group the last 2 terms, you'll notice that the 2 and the 10 have a common factor of 2. 2 goes into both of those. And so we can factor each group. And so the next step then is, after we've grouped them, which literally just means putting parentheses around the terms we want to group together. After we've done that, we're going to factor each group. Well, the first group has a Q as a common factor. If you factor it out, you have P plus 5. And then in the second group, there's a common factor of 2, and it is a positive 2. So we're going to keep our plus sign, because right now we have not made this into multiplication. We will, but right now it's still just addition. So make sure you keep your positive sign there. And when you factor the 2 out, you'll notice that you have P plus 5. Well, now that last step is factor the entire polynomial, and now this looks like the previous problems we saw where this p plus 5 is that common factor. So we're going to bring it to the front. And then when we do, we're going to have q plus 2 that's left. And so now there's our final answer. And again, you may say, well, can I check that? Well, yeah, absolutely. If you FOIL the first, outer, inner, last, you're going to get those same 4 terms at the top. For example, if you do p times q, you're going to get pq. P times 2 is going to be the 2p. 5 times q is the 5q. 5 times 2 is 10. And so if you FOIL that back together, you will see that you get all 4 of those terms that we started with. Okay? Now, again, if you have questions about that, let me know. We're going to work through several of these, though, and I think that'll hopefully make pretty good sense for you. So when you look at this next problem, again, we want to group our terms so we can take out letters and numbers if at all possible. Well, in this case, if I group the first 2 terms together, there's a common factor of 2 and a common factor of a, so I get a number and a letter. And if I group the last 2 terms together, there's a common factor of 3 and a common factor of b. And so again, letter and number. So this is probably going to work fine for us. If we do this factoring and we don't have the 2 parentheses be the same, we messed up. Okay, we need to try different grouping. Hopefully it won't be a big deal to do that, but and hopefully we don't have to do that. But every now and then you might get in a situation where you grouped something incorrectly and have to go back and regroup. So in this case, grouping first and last will work. And when we group the first 2, again, we have a common factor of 2a. So we'll factor that out. What's left then is a minus 2. And then in the second term, we have a common factor of 3b. It is a positive 3b. And so we'll factor that out, and we're left with a minus 2. Well, again, now we get to this point where we have this a minus 2 that these 2 binomials have in common. So that's our common factor. We'll bring a minus 2 to the front. And what's left when we take it out is 2a plus 3b. And again, that's all there is to that once you have your terms grouped in the right order. If you have questions about that, let me know. Now, look at the next one. So the next one's a little bit different. If you look at this, again, there's not a greatest common factor. We're going to sort of in our minds check for that each time, but a lot of times there's not going to be one. And so there's not anything they all have in common. For example, that last term only has a 3. The others have variables. Only one other term has a 3, and so no common factors. Now, when we think about grouping our terms, you could group the first 2 together. Don't write this down, just watch for a second. You could group the first 2 together, and you'll see they both have a y, so it has a common factor of y. But if we group the last 2 together, there's not a common factor other than 1. Now, you can use 1 sometimes, but we want to group it so we can take out letters and numbers if at all possible. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that we consider regrouping this one. Okay? And here's what I think about when I think about the regrouping. I notice that if I can put the 2xy and 2x together, there's a 2 and an x both they have in common, right? That would be number and letter. And then I also notice that if I put the 3y and the 3 together and group those, well, they have a common factor of 3. No other letter, but that's okay. And so I'm going to regroup these and put 2xy plus 2x together. And then I'm going to group the 3y and the 3 together. Now, as we group those, now we can see, okay, they're going to both have common factors. So in the first group, we have a common factor of 2x. And when you factor it out, you're left with y plus 1. In the last set, there's a common factor of 3. And when you factor that out, you're left with y plus 1. Well, now again, our 2 sets of parentheses have a common factor, are the same. That is the common factor. And so we'll factor out y plus 1. And what's left is 2x plus 3. And so there's our final answer. Now, what if you had not regrouped? You could have still gotten the same answer. Again, I told you, usually there's 2 ways that work and 1 way that doesn't. So you could not have grouped 2xy and 3. That wouldn't have worked. But you could have grouped it the way it's written. And if you did, again, I'm just going to quickly write this out for you. You don't have to write this down. So if you had grouped it this way, like it's written, do the first 2 and the last 2, you would have had a common factor of y, and then had 2x plus 3 as the other, what's left, right? And then in the last term, or last group, you would have had a 1 as a common factor with 2x plus 3 that's left. And when you take out your common factor, you would have had 2x plus 3 as the common factor with y plus 1 with what's left. Now, notice this is the same thing as that. The only difference is the order of the binomials, and the order of the binomials doesn't matter. As long as you have the right terms together, you're fine. I don't like doing this at the top because if that 1 is the only thing I can take out, I don't really know until I kind of look ahead at this one to know if it's going to work. Where if you regroup it like I did originally, well, we know, okay, we've got the 2x and we have the 3 both as our common factors, and then whatever's left in that parentheses should be that common factor. And so just be aware that you could have done this one a different way. Again, usually 2 ways that you can group it, 1 way you can't. And so both of these ways do work. Now, look at the next one. On this one, we again want to group our terms so we can take out letters and numbers, and as many of those as possible. So if I group the first 2 together, again, there's not a common factor. First term has x's only, the last term only has a number, and so no common factors. And I notice that if I group the first 2 terms together, there's 2 x's, x squared, as the common factor, right? And if I group the last 2 terms together, I have 5 that goes into 5 and 15. And so it makes some sense that I might want to keep it as the first 2 with the last 2. So here's the issue that we might run into. If we group those first 2, no problem. When we go to group the second 2, though, you do not want to do this because that indicates that the negative would have to get distributed, and that's not the case. Okay. However, you also don't want to do this. Let's see if I can get my pen back. You don't want to do that because then it indicates that we're already multiplying, and that's also not true. And so when we put parentheses around this, we need to be really careful. So here's what I'm going to suggest you do. I'm going to suggest you make this plus a negative and group the negative inside the parentheses because that negative only applies to the 5x, not to the negative 15. And so you don't want to put it with the negative on the outside where you distribute, but you also don't want to not have a sign there either. And so be careful when you're putting your parentheses around this one. Now, once we do get them grouped, we're going to factor each group. So in the first group, x squared is the common factor. And we'll factor it out, and we'll have x plus 3 that's left. And then in that last group, we need to take out the common factor. So what is it? You may be saying 5, and that's true. But the question becomes, do we want to take out 5, or do we want to take out negative 5? And some of you may think negative, but you don't maybe know why. Okay, so let me make sure you're clear on why we would want to take out a negative. Because we do want to take out a negative 5 as the common factor. We want the parentheses that we end up with here to match this one, the x plus 3. And so you'll notice the x and 3 are both positive. Well, if we take out a positive 5, we're going to be left with negative x minus 3. And so that's not going to be good for us. And so we need this x term to be a positive in the parentheses. And so if we factor out a negative, well, then that's going to change that sign and make it be a positive. And so when we factor out the negative 5 divided by negative 5 is a positive 1x. And then negative 15 divided by negative 5 is a positive 3. Well, now we end up with the x plus 3 being the same in both set of parentheses. So again, that becomes our final and our greatest common factor. And then what's left is x squared minus 5. If you do not factor out the negative 5, then it's wrong. You have to make sure you get that negative out. Okay? So if you're not sure, do I take positive or negative out? Think it one step ahead of, if I factor this negative out or if I factor this positive out, what are my signs that are left in the parentheses? Because it needs to match the first set, right? If you had negative x minus 3 in the second set, well, that's not the same. And so you have to make sure the signs are the same. So be aware of that as you're doing this regrouping. Now, sometimes we have some where we have to regroup. Okay, the ones we've looked at so far have not had to be regrouped. We did regroup one, but it's not always the case. Sometimes, though, we have to regroup. In both of these situations, that is the case. We cannot group the first two terms and the last two terms in this next problem. We have to group it in other ways. And there's two other ways you could do it, but I would again recommend that you do look at taking out letters and numbers both. And so here's what I see when I look at this one. I see that if I can group the 6y squared and the 15y together, there's a common factor of 3, because 3 goes into both numbers, and there's a y as a common factor. So that's good. I also notice that if I can group the negative 20w and the negative 8w, well, negative 4 or positive 4 goes into those, and they both have a w. And so I think I need to regroup it in that way. Now, if you say, well, I want to group 6y squared and the negative 8yw, that would also work. It's not my preference, but that would also work. So I am going to regroup this one, and I'm going to rewrite it here at the top so you can see it well. And I'm going to group the 6y squared and the 15y together. And I'm going to group the negative 20w minus 8yw together. And I am keeping an addition sign between these because we want to make sure that we understand it's not multiplication, and the negative with the 20w is only on that 20w. And so we want to make sure we do keep that negative inside the parentheses. So now that we've got it grouped, we'll factor each group. In the first group, our common factor is 3y. We're left with 2y plus 5. And then in our next group, we want to take out the common factor. And again, the question is, well, what common factor do we take out? We know 4 goes into both numbers and there's a w, but do we take out a positive or a negative? Well, again, both those signs are negative currently. We need them to end up being positive so they match the 2y plus 5. So we need to take out a negative so that way our signs change. And so we're going to factor out a negative 4w. And then when we do, we're left with 5 plus 2y. Now, do our parentheses match? I can see, again, I've been doing this for a long time. Some of you are saying yes, and some of you are saying no. So the answer is yes, they do match. 5 plus 2y and 2y plus 5 are the same thing, because this is 2y plus 5 and this is 2y plus 5, right? And so they are the same. It doesn't matter the order in which you write those terms as long as they have the right signs. So that 2y plus 5 is our common factor. When you factor it out, what's left is 3y minus 4w. And again, if at any point you say, well, I'm not sure if that's right, I want to check it, all you got to do is FOIL. multiply it back together, and you should get those terms you started with. Alright, so pause the video, try the next one on your own. Alright, so this one also has to be regrouped. You cannot group the first two terms with the last two terms. So when you think about regrouping this one, what I see, and this is just kind of in my perspective, I noticed that the 9mn and the negative 3n have a 3 and an n both in common. And the negative 4 and the 12m have a 4 in common. If I had grouped the 9mn and the 12m, I would have a common factor, but then my negative 4 and negative 3n would not have had a common factor other than 1. And so, again, I try to avoid 1 as the common factor when we do this regrouping. So I'm going to group, again, the 9mn and the negative 3n together. And then I'm going to group the other two, the negative 4 and the 12m. So, again, once we get them grouped, we're going to factor each group. The first group has a common factor of 3n. When you factor that out, you're left with 3m minus 1. And then the other set, we need to take out the common factor, which obviously 4 goes into 4 and 12, but the question is it positive or negative? And I can tell you, I know some of you are thinking, well, I need to take out a negative because that first number is negative, but actually that's not the case. Because if you look at this set, the 3m minus 1, we need that m term to be a positive. And so if you look at where the m term is in this set of parentheses, well, the 12m is already positive, right? And so we want to keep that m term positive. And so to keep the signs the way they are, we'll take out a positive common factor. And so we're going to take out a positive 4 as the greatest common factor. And when you divide that out, negative 4 divided by positive 4 is a negative 1. And 12m divided by 4 is a positive 3m. And now again, 3m minus 1 and negative 1 plus 3m, they're the same thing, right? Just written in the opposite order. And so now that is our greatest common factor, 3m minus 1. And when you factor it out of each term, you're left with 3n plus 4. If you have any questions about that, let me know. This does finish section 6.1. We will stop here. The next video will begin section 6.2.